Would anyone mind closing the door, please? Thank you, Natalie. Welcome, everyone. Warren, please be quiet.
Hello.
A warm welcome to all of you. It is very nice to be here face-to-face in part, and a warm welcome to our remote attendees from all over the world. Luckily for us, we are anchored in the European time zone native to my home, but I very much appreciate all the people that are going back to bed or got up really early to attend this session. Let's go through the administrative, it's a difficult word, administrative side of things. First of all, this session is covered by the IETF Notewell. This means that we adhere to a certain code of conduct, specifically in relation to civility. Different than other meetings, there are no blue sheets to go around. I dearly miss the tradition, but if you scan the QR code that was here at the beginning of the session, or go to the agenda on your phone, there's the Meet Echo Lite application, and that's how you check in and also how you queue yourself up for the microphone. Since this is the third day of IETF, I assume that all the people in the room are somewhat familiar with that procedure. And Meet Echo, thank you very much for your assistance and help. Specific to the GROW working group, there are a number of resources. Most importantly, our agenda can be viewed online, and we have a mailing list. I would now like to ask for a minutes taker. Jared, would you like to be volunteered for this job? Good enough for me. Thank you for your services, Jared. If anybody can also keep an eye on the Meet Echo chat, which is what previously was known as the Jabber thing, to ensure that we catch any and all comments and questions that arrive from that communication channel. Do we have a volunteer for Jabber scribing? Thank you, Warren. Your services are much appreciated. But in order to fulfill this task, you will need to open your laptop. All right. Agenda. Today we have a few topics, specifically BMP, NRTM, and BMP. You can see that we mixed them up a little bit to create an interesting variance in our cadence today. Our presenters are remote. And I think unless you have anything to add, Chris, we can move to the first presentation.
Yes, please.
All right. We're not there yet. Paulo, you...
Hello.
Hello, Paulo. Good to see you.
Yes, great. And thank you for awarding, 12 minutes of the agenda, not 10 and not 15. That was greatly appreciated. It's precisely what I was looking for. So I have updates on two drafts, so the TLV and the EBIT, TLV EBIT draft. So next slide, if somebody is running the slides.
Yes, if you give me the signal, I will make it go to the next slide.
Next slide, please. And next one again. Perfect. So I skip the context because every time I present this draft, I give the context. So it's in the previous slide for who has lost the context for this one. So just a brief update on what happened since the last version of the document, so which is last IETF. Essentially, we formalized a little bit the Boolean story coming from programming background. I was thinking that just saying Boolean was clear enough, but I received that the feedback that we should specify it's a 1 byte field with 0 and 1 that can be encoded in there. So thanks very much to Jeff and Ben for their feedback about that. Following the rest of the recommendation here, they were all coming from Jeff Haas, and so we should ask Ayana for 2 new registries, one for the root monitoring message and the other for the peer down. And then we added also an error handling section, so in which essentially what we say that the TLVs are trailing, are following the BGP PDU, and of course you can decode the TLVs only if the BGP PDU is well formed. If you cannot parse that, then of course you cannot go beyond that, and so you cannot parse the TLVs. Side remark is that if you want to do an exercise which is different from conveying the messages, but you want to check the sanity of the PDU and things like that, maybe you are looking for the root mirroring instead of the root monitoring. And the second remark that was also coming from Jeff was that as we know, the message size is limited, and then this is already, a problem with the BGP PDU itself and with BMP by itself, because there is a decoration around the BGP PDU. Should it hit, itself the maximum length, and then of course this is aggravated with the use of TLVs. So it was good to make a note over there. Next slide, please. And so this is the status for the version 7 of the draft, and essentially all the feedback that was received has been processed, and there is really no more outstanding work. So this is a message for the chairs, and also I don't know if there is any questions or anything from anybody at this point.
I have a question. If there's no more outstanding work, is there running code that you can report on, implementation reports?
Yes, this is all coded on the collector side in PMSCCT. It is coded, it is working, it was tested. There is at least one vendor that I am aware that has such implementation. So yeah.
So I guess you're asking for working group last call and the sausage machinery to start running.
Yeah, I think we are already in last call. I think I want to go beyond the last call.
All right, point taken.
All right, fantastic. So next slide, please. So this is about the TLV EBIT. So this is last presented. The last time I presented this was at in Singapore in 2019. The last time that I was in person, and I think this is a very useful draft. But we received even in the room some interesting comments about it. So I thought to refresh a little bit, give context again, and share updates. So next slide, please. So what is the problem statement here is that, of course, we have TLVs that we explained in the other draft, and TLVs are public, are IANA governed, and, we ask IANA for registries, and then, every, ID in that registry will mean something. That is something for those registries governed by IANA are, of course, for elements that should be supported by everybody or generally supported. Of course, next to that, there could be some elements that are proprietary, that are not public. Why is that? There is a wealth of reasons for that. So the one of the most common is that it's a pre-standard product, right? Another one is that there is something that is commercially sensitive, but yet another point, and this is something on which I will update the introduction of the draft, is also that there could be elements that are very low level, so they cannot really be standardized, right? They could be low level or really touching the internal of an implementation that maybe it doesn't generally exist or make sense to make something, IANA governed. So this is this specific point, which is very relevant. It's not yet mentioned in the draft, and I will do in the next, release, let's say. And next slide, please. So as an introduction, just in case not everybody's familiar with the PAN, PAN is a private enterprise number, and it's a number that is assigned by IANA. So whoever can go to IANA and say, I am an enterprise, and IANA hands off an ID. I don't know if it's whoever, but for example, even PMSCCT has a PAN number. Okay, so the PAN is the key in order to make the enterprise-specific part to work. And this is all, nothing new under the sun. Who knows me? I come from a lot of experience with IPFix, working with IPFix and things like that, and I just borrowed something that I think it's very useful and it totally works for IPFix, but porting that to BMP. Next slide, please. So this is how IANA governed TLV is looking like, so essentially we strip the first bit of the type for that E, and that becomes the E bit, the enterprise bit, which could be 0 or 1. So in IANA governed TLV, the E bit is 0. And then everything just stays as the other draft, the TLV draft that I just presented. Then next slide, please. In case instead it is an enterprise-specific one, the E bit goes to 1, and you see that after the length, you have the enterprise number. The enterprise number will be the PAN that I was describing before. So you have type, length, the enterprise number, and then the value. Next slide, please. So what is, the status, right? So there was, some feedback that was processed, or actually all the outstanding feedback was processed. So an operational consideration section was added, again, under suggestion of Jeff has. And essentially he was recommending that, whoever is endorsing this scheme essentially should, make publicly available their privately defined registries. And there were a number of editorial comments and things like that. There are open questions like what could be the scope of EBIT, right? So so far the scope is just the TLDs, but of course you can make private messages, you can make private stats types and things like that. I mean, we can be more ambitious than this, but I would say that first of all, and that's the next question, whether this is a work that is relevant for the working group and whether it would be accepted. And the last time, just for extra context, and with that I'm done, let's say when I asked this question, there were a little bit of mixed feeling, and then I wanted to see whether also with that remark that I was making before about that EBIT is also about, things that cannot really be standardized because maybe they are not really their internal bits or very low level and maybe do not apply to the wider, public. Doesn't make sense to make an IANA code point for that, whether that changes anything, right?
Are there any questions from participants or the room? I see Ben virtually wants to get in the queue and is now physically moving towards the microphone.
Ben Madison, work online. Hi, Paolo.
Hey.
So I think this is a generally good idea. And I think that given the overlap from an implementation perspective that's likely to exist between BMP and IPFix, I think kind of stealing the mechanism is also a good idea. Question on, Job, could you go back to the packet format slide? The one for the enterprise variant, the next one. Is it coming?
I see
anyway.
it here.
So the private enterprise number field, is
Yeah.
the idea that that contains only the private enterprise number, or would that be the would that be some locally significant value qualified by the private enterprise number? Because
No.
if that
No, that would be just the enterprise number. So the PAN, the public, the private enterprise number, but the type would be the, locally qualifying.
Okay, I see. So the enterprise number acts as a namespace scope for the type field.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yes.
So my only concern here is that this ends up being a way for vendors to all implement essentially the same thing, but with their own special name and syntax and, various different ways in which you have to write the same code 100 times in order to operate a multi-vendor network. I think maybe a slightly stronger recommendation about making a registry available possibly in some sort of minimally machine readable format might go some way to help alleviate that. But I think, a fairly strong recommendation that this should not be used other than for, temporarily for things that are likely, even in the distant future, to be standardized would be helpful, because we don't want, a situation where every vendor in the whole world has got a separate type for ASPath, for example. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And you see, this is very along the lines of the feedback that was provided also in Singapore in 2019, and that time who was saying that was actually, it was Job, right? Our very true Job. And my answer back then, and that's the only thing that I can answer today, is that, so first of all, is that we should put in there all the text possible, right? We should make this happen because it's useful, and put in there all the text possible in terms of recommendation and things like that. And the second thing is that we can look at the story of IPFix, because fortunately, since we are not inventing anything, we can look at the past and see how that worked well or not with IPFix. And in IPFix, we don't see that happening, that they all have the very same thing, but not standardized, you see. There are things that are certainly remaining permanent, right? So, for example, the whole carrier grade NUT logging, for example, it's something that is staying into private elements and things like that. But that is probably because there is one vendor only implementing that, or two vendors only, you see. So from the story of IPFix, I feel to be positive that this mechanism is not abused. Of course, I don't have the Oracle, so I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm totally willing to do our part as IETF and put in there the whole wording that we should be putting in order to discourage to abuse this mechanism.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Jeff.
So backing up Ed's comments, I pasted a presentation that I'd given at a prior IETF on code point management. The challenge that you usually end up seeing for this stuff is that it's usually back pressure that you get from the registry availability. So like the majority of BMP's spaces were originally done under very tight requirements. The current one is under a specification required, which is not quite as loose as first come, first serve. And what we're looking for stuff that you would want to put into non-enterprise space is, if this is generally useful, make it as easy as possible for people to be able to publish a specification and get a code point and just ship their feature. And that said, part of the back pressure that you get is, what if you're not sure that it, something that's generally useful? Giving the vendors a playground to be able to do stuff is a useful thing. One of the sort of dangers that's discussed in the slides is that when you do these sorts of things, there's always the concern that, how stable is the vendor going to make something? If it's their magic number, maybe they're less concerned about stability than IETF might be. And we see this for incremental deployment of BGP features as an example that we give in the slides. So the enterprise number isn't bad. There is a motivation in the BMP community that if it's a generally useful feature, we should be pushing people to put the stuff into public spaces. And we'll very likely end up seeing that there are going to be transitional scenarios where stuff may show up in an enterprise field and may stay there, while also manifesting in the more public versions, because long-term the goal is people's collectors will want to gather the information from a common set of code points and not have to worry about, well, where do I get, as you say, AS path for this particular thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Benoit briefly was in the queue, but somehow disappeared. So I'll read his comment out loud. He indicates, we did not see concerns in the IPFix IE history, hopefully. So I guess that is a positive sign towards using pen numbers in context of BMP.
So let me redo it, right? I want to make it short, but okay, let me go to the mic now. So Benoit Claes, so yes, in the history of IPFix, we had the same concern initially, and we have not seen that. Most of the people were actually eager to come and propose them to IANA as in IPFix information elements. The only one that were not done in IANA, there were particular reasons, like it was, we would know we could not get consensus across the industry, but these are really corner cases. So it was a concern for us initially, and in the end, it was not.
Thank you. Jeff, you're still in the queue. Is the queue cleared up? So the to-do items, Paolo. The EBIT thing, you said it's in working group last call and the chairs need to do work. And for
the TLD, not the EBIT. The other one.
In this presentation, you mentioned 2 drafts, right?
Yes, the first one, yeah.
The first one needs to complete the working group last call.
Exactly.
And the second one, you propose to request working group adoption.
Exactly.
All right, we will do those action items.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Paolo. Next up is Sasha Romain. I think I should actually ask you how to pronounce it in English.
I don't even know how to pronounce it in English.
In Dutch, it's Romein. Sasha, please indicate when you want me to move to the next slide. And the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. My first IETF meeting, actually. So yeah, my name is Sasha Romain. I'm presenting the draft on the near real-time mirroring protocol version 4, co-authored with Job Snijders at Strain and Stavros Konstantaris. Next slide, please. So a little bit of context first. NRTM-v4 is a protocol for IAR mirroring. As many of you may be aware, but maybe not all, the Internet Routing Registry actually consists of about a dozen sort of authoritative registries. They have different operators, different purposes, different scopes. And mirroring exists for these different registries to be able to mirror data from each other. It's a one-way process. So, for example, if someone queries entity comms IR server, they also see data that has been mirrored from RIPE and things like that. And also a number of operators run their own local mirrors. They don't have authoritative, but they run their own mirrors for performance analysis, things like that. There are a few common implementations for IR servers. There's a few versions of the RIPE database software out there, which runs the registries from RIPE NCC and Afrinic and APNIC. There is a legacy version of IARD, version 2 and 3, that's currently run by RDB, Level 3, LTB, a few other smaller ones. And there is the latest IARD version 4, which is actively developed still by me. And runs most of the other larger registries. Next slide, please. So currently this mirroring is done with NRTM version 3 and mostly FTP downloads. This is a very poorly specified protocol. There's PDF somewhere. It's plain text over raw TCP sockets. There's no way to check any kind of integrity or authenticity. It scales very poorly. Essentially, it's very difficult to scale at all. There is no status signaling. So if you query a server for new changes, there is no automated way for it to tell you, you don't have access, or I don't know what you're asking, or everything is fine, I just don't have any new data. So there's no way to detect when it breaks. There's also the streaming of new changes, and the FTP downloads that you initialize with are completely unlinked, basically, and you sort of have to hope that you got the right two matched up, because there are many fascinating ways in which NRTM version 3 can break quietly, weirdly. It's actually a major source of support I give to users of IRD version 4. Next slide, please. So the new draft is publishing NRTM data, publishing the IR mirroring data on a HTTPS endpoint, which creates all the benefits that we have with publishing things on HTTPS, which is a thing we know very well how to do. It is inspired by IRDP, so there are some similar concepts and names in here. There is a small update notification file, which functions as a often retrieved index and points to a snapshot, some deltas, usually with changes in them. And the snapshots are periodic. They contain all the records at that time in the IR database. They are large, and small deltas only contain changes. They're batched into 1 minute timeframes if there were any changes. And all these files are JSON-based. They all support UTF-8. Currently in NRTM v3 and FTP, there's no standard on encoding, so all the mirroring is full of encoding glitches everywhere. The snapshots and deltas themselves are immutable and they are cacheable, so that helps with scaling them. And the update notification file itself is signed and contains hashes of all the referred files. So this allows integrity checking. A bit more on that later, because there's still some open ends, but the idea is to offer integrity checking, which we are currently missing. And finally, there's a random session ID which has to match. Otherwise, clients reinitialize, and this basically allows mirror servers to force clients to reinitialize, which there's currently no way for. So if somehow there are gaps in history, clients silently and without possibility of detection or recovery run out of sync. And yeah, it's bad. Next slide, please. So for mirror servers, the process is basically going to be they generate new session IDs. I'm obviously skipping over a lot of details here, but this is the broad overview. They generate a new session ID, generate their first snapshot, which sometimes may be empty, not typically. New update notification file, publish that on an endpoint, and then you're running NRTM version 4. I should note that this is everything in the protocol is per IR database. So RIPE and C, who publishes RIPE and RIPE non-auth, these are totally separate for NRTM version 4. Next slide, please. For updates, every minute, each mirror server will generate a Delta file if there were any changes. If they were a little late, if they had downtime, they can catch up. But generally, every minute, if there were changes, and they are all sequentially numbered, so you can always know that you have a consistent, complete set of Delta files without gaps. They then generate and sign a new update notification file. Also, periodically, there's new snapshot files, so that new clients who show up, they need to start with a snapshot file, so that shouldn't be too old. It's not necessarily every change, so we don't generate snapshots every minute. They're too large for that. But the idea is that clients don't start off too far behind. There's also a regeneration of the update notification file, even if it hasn't changed, which allows detection of still repositories. Some IAR databases are incredibly quiet. They have one change every few weeks, maybe. So this allows to detect, like, is an IR server still publishing to this endpoint or not? And an important distinction to note with compared to NRTM version 3 is that none of the data that is transferred between servers and clients is different per client. The mirror server publishes one set of changes that contains everything any client needs. Next slide, please. Mirror clients, they retrieve the update notification file and signature. They verify it. If there's data there and the session ID matches, if it's the same version, you're up to date, and you don't have to do anything. Otherwise, the client tries to pull in the deltas to get to the latest version. If those are not all present, because probably the client has run too far behind, or if the session ID has become different, the client will always reinitialize from the snapshot, automatically retrieve that, verify, process it, then continue following along with the deltas again. So if clients run out of sync, if there's a new publication point, clients always automatically recover. Next slide, please. I won't go through all the fields of the file in detail. That's all in the draft, but this is the update notification file, which, as you can see, essentially lists the current snapshot and the version of that, along with all deltas, the IR database that this is for, and a timestamp of publication to detect stillness. Next slide, please. The snapshot file itself is fairly simple, contains also session ID, version, source name, so that we know those are consistent, and essentially a list of objects. NRTM version 4 intentionally does not go into the actual syntax of IR objects, basically because we don't have a singular syntax of IR objects. So yeah, that's why they're presented as encoded strings. Next slide, please. And so finally, the Delta files are similar. They list changes. So one Delta file can have at least one, possibly many different changes of deletions, additions, modifications to objects. Next slide. Of course, any point of the draft is open to discussion, but I wanted to highlight two particular ones. The first is the database configuration file. As I mentioned, the update notification file is signed, and it then contains hashes of snapshots. And the idea here is that we provide end-to-end integrity checking. So the IR server that published it, all the way to the IR server that is processing this. There's also HTTPS, which offers transport security for part of this, but not all of it. The problem, of course, then becomes, how does a client know which public key to trust, and how do we deal with key rotation, for example, because people will want to rotate their keys. Mirror clients don't really sign up. There's not really a single way to effectively reach them. And so this is, we have a plan for this now in the draft, but this is definitely the most open to discussion. Next slide, please. So the current approach we've chosen is to have an additional file, the database configuration file, which contains IR database name, like RIPE, RIPE non-auth, public signing key of the update notification file, and the URL where this file should be expected. And this file is different from all the others in that it must be published on a well-known URI on what I've called the generally known authoritative domain. So other files can be published wherever the operator wants to. This one has to be published on this particular domain. It's also low traffic. And the idea here is that if I would say RADB, then everyone who is familiar with the IR system would agree on the same domain name that we would all trust to say, where do we retrieve the update notification file? Where do we retrieve NRTM version 3? Where is the FTP server? And so to use that as a basis of trust and allow configuration from there. This is our approach so far. Next slide, please. I only have 2 more slides, so question maybe at the end. Another problem is delta expiration, because many of our clients will very closely follow all the deltas that are being published. They retrieve the snapshot, the update notification file, frequently download any new deltas. They're going to download a handful at a time. And these are also the ones that we want to have low latency. So that's why we make them every minute. Some clients, though, are going to lag behind. They're going to be down for a while, have connectivity issues, anything can happen. And sometimes they are days, weeks, potentially even months behind, and they're going to start up. And with 1 minute, one delta every minute, potentially there are up to 1,440 deltas per day. But for many databases, I run some numbers, it's much less, more in the order of hundreds, but still significant. Next slide, please. And so the initial idea was trim the deltas so that their size cumulatively is less than a snapshot. So the idea is downloading a gigabyte of deltas is better than downloading 2 gigabytes of snapshot because it's still less data. However, IR data, based on some rough calculation, is changing too slowly. And so a client that is running 3 years behind on RIPE would still prefer deltas and would try to download 250,000 of them, which obviously doesn't scale. So optimizing for size does not work here. Next slide, please. So the current new plan is we expire fast after 24 hours. So anyone who is more than 24 hours behind has to reinitialize from the snapshot. Upside is this is simple. You might still have 1,400 downloads if you're a day behind, although for many databases it would be less. We feel that it would be a good balance between allowing catch-up, preventing excessive downloads, and simplicity. Also good to remember is this is all automatic in NRTM version 3. This is all manual, like an operator has to actively start the fresh re-downloading process. Another idea we had is delta aggregation, where we aggregate older ones into larger blocks that are in a single download and can be processed in bulk. It's more optimal. It's more complex. Personally, I don't like it so much. But of course, we're also open to other ideas. Next slide, please. So the status, The authors of the draft, Ed works on the database team at RIPE NCC, and I am the author and maintainer of IRD version 4. So the authors, we are also the people who need to work on implementation, so there's support from there. The RIPE database working group, I've also presented a broad strokes of this in a BOF session, and that was generally supported. So there is support in other places also for at least the general concept and ideas. It was posted on the mailing list. There hasn't been any feedback yet, and I would like to propose this draft for working group adoption. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. The reason I invited Sasha specifically to the GROW working group is that from all the IETF working groups, GROW has a history of mingling with IRR-related topics. So for instance, in end of 2015, we published RFC 76A2, Considerations for Internet Routing Registries. There has not been done in the IETF any prior work on NRTM. So NRTM version 3 is a 2-page specification hosted on the RIPE website. So from that perspective, it felt appropriate to bring it to this working group. And the chairs will bring the request to the mailing list to gauge interest. Let's go through some questions. I see Ben and Jeff queued up.
Hi, Sasha. Ben Madison from Work Online. Thank you for working on this. It's really, really long overdue. There are some really confusing topics that I have to take new recruits through. And what to do when NRTM version 3 breaks is, I think, probably the worst of it. So it's really nice to see someone who's actively working on this. It looks, I read a really, really early markdown version of this that I came across somewhere, but I haven't read the most recent draft. But I think from what you've described, it sounds like a sane solution to the problem. One thing that I found slightly confusing is the term session ID, because that seems like it's used not so much to identify a session between a server and a particular client as to identify the base from which a delta is taken. So it's kind of identifying the current snapshot that's most recent. So I think maybe a change of terminology there would make that less confusing. I had one suggestion about how to deal with the trust anchor discovery problem. That's a little bit less hand-wavy than kind of hoping that everybody knows that radb is radb.net, which is probably true. It's probably not a terrible assumption, but it's maybe not very robust. One of the problems as an operator that mirrors IRR data is there's not really a good list of things that one ought to be mirroring, and there's not really a good list as a consumer of transit services, for example, of which databases can I register my things in and expect them to be generally available to anyone who I care about. And that's maybe a problem we can solve at the same time as this by having an IANA registry, which is fairly permissive in terms of its policies, but where people can actually go and register source names. And that can then be mapped into the DNS somehow, or, there's a whole bunch of, once you've got a registry of unique names like that, and there's a mapping between source and somewhere to go, then a whole bunch of possible solutions to that problem start presenting themselves.
Yeah, I do like the IANA registry idea. I think we had it briefly, but then I was thinking, like, what if I email IANA and I say, hey, I'm RIPE, and here's the new key that should be used for update notification file, and we're hosting it on this domain now, which would also then need some kind of verification process. But I think there are definitely ways to approach that. This is sort of the shortened version, but I agree with you also, like, just in terms of what registries are out there, and like I sometimes have struggled finding like what registries are out there. Yeah. So I think the IANA registry is an interesting approach. approach.
Yeah, I think that if the content, the initial contents of that registry is bootstrapped in the draft, with kind of the databases that are out there and are a thing, then the competing for the same source name problem probably doesn't really arise, because it would only be new entrants or much smaller databases that come after the fact asking for new names. There are not a lot of new IRR databases being stood up in 2022.
I'm going to cut the queue after Rudiger Volk. Ben, you have an action item, write an internet draft defining an IANA registry and some procedures around it. That's called feature scope. Jeff Haas.
Hi, this is Jeff. Sasha, I have a question. Last time I worked on this type of technology was back in 1999 for REDB. So things have obviously evolved significantly past that point, and I'm not aware of them. At that time, one of the problems around the snapshot versus the incremental diffs that you get was a dual tension between the diffs basically encoding the transactions that have passed through the server. People were interested in this for historical and other auditing reasons. And the tension of being able to quickly resynchronize when things broke and fell out of sync. This happened, especially in those days, quite a bit because the software is, the reliability of the indices, let's just say, were not very good at the time. For the work that you're doing right now, is the tension to try to reduce the amount of the Delta files based on just strictly transaction load, or is it a desire to simply limit the amount of traffic that you're expecting to see on the servers?
Well, traffic on the servers is probably not the main concern. The issue here is that if we allow a client to catch up with Delta files after 3 years, it'll take forever. Like, the client will do this automatically. It'll find that all the deltas are still there, but I don't immediately know off the top of my head how long it would take, but downloading 250,000 separate files over HTTP is going to take a while. So we are not serving the client. The goal is get the client up to speed as fast as reasonable without excessive data transfer, basically. So that's why we want to place limits on how far back a client is allowed to go on this.
Okay.
Because it's not actually going to help. Just downloading a snapshot is going to be faster at some point.
I completely agreed. One of the other pieces of the tension was finding out what version effectively a given server is running for a given database was a non-standardized item. Has that changed in the interim?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So as an example, the Delta file gives you basically individual versions. So if you're up to Delta 100, you know that this is as far as you happen to be in sync for this database. At the time, I remember that IRD for REDB did have the ability to tell you what version it thought it was at for itself. I don't recall if this actually got standardized. The motivation is that if I'm running a local cache, I could actually use that to compare versus maybe the remote cache.
It's a little bit standardized, like many things in IIR, but in NRTM v4, that would be the snapshot file. So the snapshots, update notification file. So whatever the update notification file says the latest version is, that is the latest version that was published. There is the catch, I suppose, that what the server is running at right this second could be newer, because it might take up to a minute for a change to be pushed out.
Okay.
Or is that the kind of gap you're asking about?
I think that is in the lines of what I'm asking about. If it was the case that the manifest file that's reported is provided eventual consistency, because within a minute you'll get the newest data, that's probably a reasonable thing. If a fully standardized mechanism to query the database version number is not present, that might be a thing to spend a little bit additional standardization time at, because it allows a local cache mechanism to decide, does it have data that is not fresh enough for some strange reason?
Yeah, yeah. IRD will also offer this because we have some non-standard queries right now. They become sort of standard partially once they get implemented in IRD version 4 because there's WriteDB is the only other actively developed implementation. But yeah, there will be also direct queries. But the idea is this update notification file. If you compare that to what your local version has, then you'll know whether or not your mirroring is running up to date. Also, we'll be able to actually detect errors. So that will be a big improvement, that if your local mirror cannot update, that it can actually tell you that it can update rather than producing errors all the time that may not be actual errors as you have with version 3.
The detection of local errors would be great. I remember that at the time, a significant problem during the mirroring process, using one of your other example slides, if you received an object that could not successfully be parsed locally because the implementations were different, this led to potential situations where objects were out of sync.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
If I may interject, I think, Jeff, in IRD version 3 and NRTM version 3, you refer to the serials to grok the distance between locally cached data and what the remote server has. And in the NRTM version 4 notification file, that is called the version. So I pulled that slide up. You see version 3 in NRTM version 3. Lingo would be serial free. Okay, now everybody is confused.
And again, this is because I'm asking about technology that I've not done the appropriate homework for commenting on this presentation in an informed fashion, and thank you for educating.
Next up, Jarrett. I'm looking at the clock a little bit, so please keep the comments brief.
Yeah, so I guess I'm a little bit concerned about the 1 minute snapshot requirement. Is there a reason why it isn't kind of done on demand based on when there's actually a change? Or for the for the deltas and such, because that seems like having that always be.
We have misunderstanding then. Snapshots are more rare because they're very large. Deltas are 1 minute, but only if there were changes. If your IR database never changes, the only thing you have to do is update this update notification file, which is very small, just to so that clients know like there's someone still publishing to this endpoint. Yeah, no changes means you don't generate anything.
Okay, and then the second concern I have is about whether or not IANA is the right place for there to be a registry for services that may not exist in the future, because I think many of us have seen IRR databases come online and go away over time, and going and sticking it in a registry seems a lot more permanent than what actually exists in the operational space.
Please talk to Ben. He will figure out all those concerns. Rüdiger.
Rüdiger Volk, retired backbone engineer. I wanted to jump on Job's remark that NRTM never had an official standardized definition, at least not IETF. As far as I remember, there has been for a quarter of a century IRR schema definition done in IETF. As far as I can tell, no access protocol, no on-the-wire protocol, so far as I can tell, has ever been standardized in IETF. And the existing de facto registry does not even include the information what software is run by the various registries, which is necessary for tuning or selecting your client code for successfully accessing the stuff. It's not only this, I know it by heart from the time when I still was working. Not quite sure whether this will actually be fixed before the thing is forgotten and replaced by something else and better.
Yeah, I did mention that NRTM never has been standardized by the IETF. But given the history of IETF in IRR, I felt that NRTM version 4 might be find an appropriate home here. But we'll discuss this on the mailing list in the working group call for adoption. The reason the offers are here is to make something better than a 2-page PDF hidden on a website, but make a proper document that is easy to read and understand. Sasha, thank you so much for your presentation and information. I think we are going to move on to the last presentation of the Grow session. Hey, hello, good to see you. Where on this planet are you?
I'm in Colombia, very early. Okay, it's not so early. So we're in a hurry, right? Or we are not? Tell me, John.
We started like 3 minutes late, so we'll end like 6 minutes late, right?
Perfect. So can you go into the next slide, please? So what we are proposing in this draft is basically a YANG module for managing BMP on routers. Why not? Well, the idea is to have a standard way of doing that. BMP sounds like a simple protocol, but is it? Well, simple protocol to configure and manage, but is it? Let's figure out ourselves while having these discussions. The next one, please. So what the model has basically, are the items to configure and monitor BMP on devices. That is, well, configure your stations, the connectivity for your stations, the BMP session parameters. Well, I'd like to highlight 2 things that probably are not so common between the models of the vendors that at least we have read. First is an action to clear the session with the BMP station. Well, that's basically it. And the second part is that we try to be very explicit in how we configure what we call the BMP sources. And that is, we right now have already 5 RIP modes on BMP. The latest 3 were standardized just a few months ago. So you have to be explicit on whether to say this remote is enabled for the station. Then for address families, the same. So for every address families, you don't take, there's no default. You have to enable every address family. And for the RIP modes that are actually not a single RIP, but multiple RIPs per peer, then we also would like to be explicit. That is, you can, so you enable the peers that you want to send information from or to explicitly. You can select that individually, so by reusing the remote address from the BGP module. Also by the type. Also, you can define which peers you want to select based on the type of peer. Here we are also reusing the BGP peer type from the BGP module. So you can say, please send me the information from all the external peers, for all the internals, and so on. Because we also needed a way of especially saying we want all peers. That's why we also added an enum with a single value called all peers in the BMP module, in this module, that you can use to say, okay, just send me everything for every peer. We probably will discuss this a bit more in the next iterations of the module. But let's see. Next one, please. So we already had good feedback on this. Thank you very much to team, Jeffrey and Tom for this. We already addressed some of the issues, mostly the ones from Tom that were very low-hanging fruits, and some of them very clear mistakes. in this version that we already uploaded, version 0.2. I'm not going to go into the details. Next one, please. Yeah. So we do have some pending points that we promised to tackle in the next version. Tim mentioned the BMP session options, initiation delay, backup times. We will actually take a look again to all the modules from the vendors that for configuring BMP and see what else we might be missing to try to add them. Jeffrey mentioned the TCP module. I mean, we can really leverage that module to try to not reinvent the wheel. How to use it, we're really not sure. For instance, we could actually copy the four tuple connection from there. It's not in a grouping, so maybe we can just copy it, or I don't know, or we'll see how we can integrate it, maybe, and then we can discuss it all together. Units for stats, where to place the module in the routing tree. This can be important. So if we, for instance, we put it on their network instance, then we can directly monitor the network instance from there, or we can put the network instance in a BMP source. So where to place the model is a good question to have, and of course adding examples to enlighten these trade-offs. Next one, please, John. So this is it. Grove works on the BMP, and we have been working in the last few years about this. So I think it makes sense to have this draft in the group. But I also let you guys discuss that. Besides that, if you guys have any other questions or comments, guys and girls.
Thank you. Jeff Haas, you're up first.
So yes, I absolutely think we should adopt this. I agree that there's going to be a little bit of churn as we figure out how this can be presented. For example, how do we actually monitor the various address families within network instances is going to be, I think, one of your modeling challenges. We're actually going through a similar effort for that at my employer right now at Juniper. The second item is about the TCP integration. Partially what is being discussed here is, if you want to actually just simply model the connection as something that is low copy and paste. In a lot of cases, that can make sense. Many other cases, leaf-refs make related sense. Part of the reason to point you towards the TCP module and potentially longer-term discussion towards the IETF keychain module is you'll want to figure out how authentication actually rolls into this. So if you're running like TCP AO or TLS or something else similar for the sessions, you'll want to model that not only for configuration purposes, but what your operational state is for that. That's it. Thank you.
And I agree with Jeffrey here.
Ji Dong, next up.
Yeah, I think this is useful work, really helpful for the configuration of the BMP. My brief comment is that it is better to consider the alignment with the BGP model, like maybe it is first based on the instance and then peers and the RIBs, because the user of the BMP will be also the users for the BGP models, so that the alignment between these two models will be very helpful. Second one is also based on the YAM model design in the BGP model. It may reduce the amount of configurations in some circumstance, like for each RIB, you may need to, with this current model, you may need to configure the different peers for different RIBs, but if you follow the BGP model style, you can configure the peer, then the RIB in and RIB out can just follow it under the peer model. That is, yeah. For some more detailed comments, we can maybe have some further discussion offline. Thank you.
Thank you. And our purpose here is to reuse the BGP module as much as possible. I mean, we tried. Maybe we are missing some. We're having some gaps, but that is the idea. So indeed, address families and peers, and even peer types are right now referenced the BGP module. When we find a location into the let's say routing tree, we might be able to make it more direct. Yeah, but that's the idea.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so the to-do item for the chairs appears to be to issue a call for working group adoption. This would be, I think, the first time the GROW working group has any involvement with Yang. So there might be a bit of a learning curve for some of us, at least for me, myself. But together we are strong. John, thank you so much for this presentation. And this concludes the GROW session at IETF 113. I hope to see all of you at IETF 114 in Philadelphia. And a big thank you to the Meet Echo team. I have to say this has been the smoothest running hybrid session I have been part of. So folks behind the camera, thank you very much. Well, go enjoy your break and see you next time. I'll do that.